We are in First Kings chapter 3. We've just been sort of introduced to Solomon. The introduction to Solomon was a little bit interesting. He sort of got rid of the advisors to David, some of whom had supported a different son for king, and that's the reason. But it's just interesting how allies become enemies and enemies become allies sometimes. Yeah. Because some of those Joab and others that he had killed were close allies of David's, but they supported the wrong king. So we start off with, but Solomon's life is very interesting. So, and we have a very, I don't think this comes up in the lectionary, but it's a super powerful story we're going to read today. So, okay. So chapter 3, Solomon made a marriage alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt. He took Pharaoh's daughter and brought her into the city of David until he had finished building his own house and the house of the Lord and the wall around Jerusalem. The people were sacrificing at the high places, however, because no house had yet been built for the name of the Lord. It's a really important thing. So do you remember the story of the woman at the well?
Mm-hmm.
And the woman at the well, she says a couple I think it's a fascinating story for cultural reasons. It's people. So she says, so they're at Jacob's well. She says, well, and she's a Samaritan. Okay. She says, well, we come here to the well of our ancestor. Well, isn't Jacob the ancestor of the Jews too? Right. And then the other thing she says is, well, you say you have to worship in the temple, talking to Jesus, but we worship on the mountaintops. And, you know, what's with that, basically, she says. Well, at this point, the temple's not built, right? So Solomon is going to supervise the construction of the temple. You notice in this first little paragraph, he says, building the house of the Lord and the wall around Jerusalem. So it's already in his plans, right? But then the next little line there, the people were sacrificing at the high places. So at the time of Solomon, the holy place for sacrifice, for worship, was on the high places, the top of the mountains, right? So it's interesting, just by the time of Jesus, that is foreign to them. They only worship at the temple.
Yeah.
But here it is part of their normal practice. So it's interesting how it changes, right? That they're all the same people for the most part. Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of his father David. Only he sacrificed and offered incense at the high places. The king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there, for that was a principal high place. Solomon used to offer 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar. At Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night, and God said, "Ask what I should give you." And Solomon said, "You have shown great and steadfast love to your servant, my father David, because he walked before you in faithfulness, in righteousness, and in uprightness of heart toward you. And you have kept for him this great and steadfast love, and have given him a son to sit on his throne today. And now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of my father David, although I am only a little child. I do not know how to go out or come in. And your servant is in the midst of the people whom you have chosen, a great people, so numerous they cannot be numbered or counted. Give your servant therefore an understanding mind to govern your people, able to discern between good and evil. For who can govern this, your great people?"
And how old is he at this point? Do we know?
I think we talked last week, he's probably about 12.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
heard you saying that.
Now, on one hand, you'd say, well, that's really young. On the other hand, children were matched off to be married around 13 or 14.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's.
Yeah.
Well, I think he was already pretty wise in the ways of the world, because, you know, when he married the princess or the daughter of the Pharaoh, he kind of consolidated, his situation there between them and Egypt too, according to what the Bible says. It's a definite.
There's a lot here. He
Mhm.
fortifies the city. Remember, they're warring. The cities get warred against all the time. He builds an elaborate palace. He builds I don't think a temple. I don't think it's the temple at this point. And he does the political alliance with Egypt. That's fascinating. Like,
Mhm. Right.
pretty wise already before he asks for wisdom.
Yeah. Right.
Right. So, and we will see before too long here him building the temple. So maybe even today we'll start some of that. It pleased the Lord that Solomon had asked this. God said to him, because you have asked this and have not asked for yourself long life or riches, or for the life of your enemies, but have asked for yourself understanding to discern what is right, I now do according to your word. Indeed, I give you a wise and discerning mind. No one like you has been before you, and no one like you shall arise after you. I give you also what you have not asked, both riches and honor all your life. No other king shall compare with you. If you will walk in my ways, keeping my statutes and my commandments, as your father David walked, then I will lengthen your life. When Solomon awoke, it had been a dream. He came to Jerusalem, where he stood before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. He offered up burnt offerings and offerings of well-being, and provided a feast for all his servants. Okay. Now,
It's interesting there. That God says, if you'll walk in my ways, keeping my statutes and commandments, as your father David walked, because we talked several times about how David was not all that good.
well, yeah, but was there there was no point where an advisor, a prophet, said to him, God says do this, and he did something different, though.
Yeah.
Yeah, he definitely, killed people and sometimes even assassinated them and did some pretty dirty, underhanded things. But
Yeah.
did he follow what God told him to do when the prophet told him? Generally, he did. So,
I found something interesting here to go back. It says here on verse 7, where he says, I'm only a little child. It says, the birth of Solomon is generally placed approximately the middle of David's 40-year reign, meaning that Solomon was about 20 years old at the beginning of his own reign.
and
lacked experience in assuming responsibilities. So
I looked up something last week that said he was a little younger, but that's,
well, you never know. I mean,
but either way, he's not,
Yeah.
even 20, he's not very old.
Right.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay. This is a very interesting thing. Here we go. Later, 2 women who were prostitutes came to the king and stood before him. The one woman said, please, my lord, this woman and I live in the same house, and I gave birth while she was in the house. Then on the 3rd day after I gave birth, this woman also gave birth. We were together. There was no one else with us in the house. Only the 2 of us were in the house. It sounds like the beginning of a mystery story, like a Sherlock Holmes story. She's laying out all of the circumstances. Then this woman's son died in the night because she lay on him. She got up in the middle of the night and took my son from beside me while your servant slept. She laid him at her breast and laid her dead son at my breast. When I rose in the morning to nurse my son, I saw that he was dead, but when I looked at him closely in the morning, clearly it was not the son I had born. But the other woman said, no, the living son is mine and the dead son is yours. The first said, no, the dead son is yours and the living son is mine. So they argued before the king. Then the king says, the one says, this is my son that is alive and your son is dead, while the other says, not so, your son is dead and my son is living one. So the king said, bring me a sword. And they brought a sword before the king. The king said, divide the living boy in 2, then give half to the one and half to the other. But the woman whose son was alive said to the king, because compassion for her son burned within her, "Please, my lord, give her the living boy. Certainly do not kill him." The other said, "It shall be neither mine nor yours divided." Then the king responded, "Give the first woman the living boy. Do not kill him. She is his mother." All Israel heard of the judgment that the king had rendered, and they stood in awe of the king, because they perceived that the wisdom of God was in him to execute justice. I love that story. You know, I love stories that we kind of know, but we don't hear.
Mhm.
It's fascinating story. You know, what would have happened if they had responded differently?
Yeah.
If the women had responded differently? Interesting. That's sort of the story that they use for showing how wise Solomon is. There's a few other little things, but that's the big one. So,
Mhm.
anyway, okay. I just there's elements that it's prostitutes and they live in the same house,
Yeah.
which means it's probably that's the house that's used for the prostitution, right? So, and there's no such thing as birth control. So you imagine prostitutes were pregnant a lot of the time, and who's the father, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of kind of cultural things that are sort of buried there too, I think. But okay. Sorry. King Solomon was king over all Israel, and these were his high officials. Anyone else want to read all these names?
No, just skip over all those
Yeah,
guys.
let's go.
Priests and secretaries, a recorder, commander of the army, priests over the officials, priests and the king's friend. Yeah. Solomon had 12 officials over all Israel who provided food for the king and his household. Each one had to make provision for 1 month in the year. These were their names. Ben-Hur.
Isn't that funny?
Ben-Hur.
Doesn't Ben mean son of?
Yes, it does.
So, but Ben Decker, Ben's her, Ben has it. Yeah.
And it's also bin sometimes is that too.
Mhm.
And it's often in the like Simon bin something would mean son of Simon.
Mhm.
Yeah. Lots of names for the different so here's another, we're talking about his wisdom, right? Think about how David ruled. He pretty much ruled from within his temple complex. That was it. And he had an army, but Solomon has already fortified the city. He has governors essentially. He's making a lot of wise decisions right off the bat, right? He's spreading the ruling administratively out, so it's not all focused just on him and on Jerusalem, which I think is very smart. Judah and Israel, whereas I'm skipping all the way to verse 20.
Right.
Lots of names. Judah and Israel were as numerous as the sand by the sea. They ate and drank and were happy. Oh, I just noticed something. I'm going to backtrack. Verse 11 and verse 15 say that those people who were his governors had taken different women, Solomon's daughter, as his wife. Well, wait a second. Did we just skip some time? Is he now older? Because how has he had a daughter that's old enough to be married?
Yeah.
Likely the son of David. Okay, mine says that on 11, Benabad was likely the son of David, David's brother, making him Solomon's first cousin.
It says
Not his.
he had Tappath, Solomon's daughter, as his wife.
Well, you're right.
Yeah.
Well, if they started at 12, they probably had a lot of kids by the time he was 20.
Yeah.
But old enough to get married?
Well, let's see. I don't know about that.
That's where I'm like, well, hold on a second. Anyway, okay. Don't think about it.
Yeah.
Judah and Israel was numerous as the sand by the sea. They ate and drank and were happy. Solomon was sovereign over all the kingdoms from the Euphrates to the land of the Philistines, even to the border of Egypt. They brought tribute and served Solomon all the days of his life. Solomon's provision for one day was 30 cores of choice flour. I don't know what a core is, but 60 cores of meal, 10 fat oxen. Wow. I know how much that is. And 20 pasture-fed cattle, 100 sheep, besides deer, gazelles, roebucks, and fatted fowl. That's one day?
For Solomon.
Mhm.
Or
A lot to
it-
eat.
it's
It's a
got
lot
to
to
be-
eat for one day.
Well, he had a big court.
Yeah, it's like, for he had dominion over all the region west of the Euphrates, from Tipshah to Gaza, over all the kings west of the Euphrates, and he had peace on all sides.
Okay, so it's for all those people too.
Maybe, yeah.
Mhm.
During Solomon's lifetime, Judah and Israel lived in safety, and Dan even to Beersheba. Dan is one of the 12 tribes. All of them under their vines and fig trees. I'm going to come back to that in a second. Solomon also had 40,000 stalls of horses for his chariots and 12,000 horsemen. Those officials supplied provision for King Solomon and for all who came to King Solomon's table. Each one in his month, they let nothing be lacking. They also brought to the required place barley and straw for the horses and swift steeds, each according to his charge. So those 12 governors also sort of paid tax, essentially. So they brought tribute to King Solomon to make sure that he was taken care of. So I'm trying to remember where it is. Do you notice it says all of them lived under their vine and fig tree?
Mhm.
Did you catch that? There's two references to that I want to bring up, and I'm going to look one of them up on my phone real quick. So in the musical Hamilton, there is a line. So it was actually said. So a lot of what's in Hamilton was actually was said. And in George Washington's farewell address, George Washington actually said, but I taught this in Hamilton. I'm ready to recline under my vine and fig tree. And that's Hamilton in the story, and possibly in real life, tries to convince him that he should stay as president a little longer. That was before they had a 4-year term. I think he was president like 17 years, right? So he was president a long time. And he says, no, I would rather retire now while I still have energy and strength than die in office, essentially. So I want to recline under my vine and fig tree. It is definitely in Micah, but it also is mentioned here. I think it's in a few places in Micah, Zechariah. I'm assuming that this would be the first time it's in scripture because it's earlier. The implication is that if you are under your vine and fig tree, you are not out doing war. You're not out. You're able to relax and enjoy the fruits of your labor and your life, right? So
living the good life.
It's an interesting. I just love that imagery. It's a few times in scripture and it keeps getting repeated. Maybe I can in my life, recline under my vine and fig tree. It's just a neat. I just love the thought. So the implication here is all of the people under Solomon's reign could live under their vine and fig tree, which is once you see the connection, it's kind of nice. Otherwise, you go, what does it mean? They're under their vine, right? But part of it is, the figs were plentiful, vines were plentiful, and they make food too, right? So both of them do, right? So you're there with your food and your shade, and maybe you have a lovely person fanning you with a palm. So verse 29. Well, let me back up. So each of the, said in the last section, each of the, where all the names were, each of the 12 governors was required to sort of provide for the king and the court 1 month out of the year. So maybe, yeah, they brought the flour and the oxen and all that stuff for each month. God gave Solomon very great wisdom, discernment, and breadth of understanding as vast as the sand on the seashore, so that Solomon's wisdom surpassed the wisdom of all the people of the East and all the wisdom of Egypt. He was wiser than anyone else, wiser than Ethan the Ezrahite, and Heman and Calcol and Darda, children of Mahal. His fame spread throughout all the surrounding nations. He composed 3,000 proverbs, and his songs numbered 1,005. He would speak of trees, from the cedar that is in the Lebanon to the hyssop that grows in the wall. He would speak of animals and birds and reptiles and fish. People came from all the nations to hear the wisdom of Solomon. It came from all the kings of earth who had heard of his wisdom. So we know that the Proverbs and many of the Psalms were inspired by or written by Solomon. That's the So when it says 1,000, however many thousands of proverbs and songs, the songs are the Psalms. So, and probably other ones also, but and Song of Solomon, which is a book, right? So to say that one person in the Old Testament influenced at least 3 books is a lot.
Yeah.
I mean, Moses influenced 5 books, the first 5, but so, outside of that, mostly it's one character, maybe multiple characters influence one book, but Solomon was a strong influence on several of the books in the Bible. So we are now to the temple. Now, I am gonna skip, but I'm not gonna skip everything. We're gonna bounce around a little bit in the temple because a lot of this has to do with, I have really neat pictures that I'll show you. There are very specific measurements and instructions and stuff like that in here. When we get to that point, I'll sort of summarize as much as I can, but I don't want to skip too much because in some cases it's interesting to talk about the rationale behind some of the things, like why seed, that sort of thing. What are you gonna say, Nancy?
I was just gonna say, I remember we went through all that once before when he it wasn't Solomon, but it was somebody was building the temple, remember? And we went through it step by step, and that so many feet and so many this and so many that, and this to this corner and that to that corner. And
so we did that with the building of the tabernacle.
Right, it was a tabernacle, sorry, yeah.
But that's, I'm glad you brought that up, because the tabernacle and the temple are very closely connected, because the size of the tabernacle is a tent, but the size and some of the ornaments and stuff were the same with what they did in the temple, including having the Holy of Holies. They had a Holy of Holies in the tabernacle where they kept it out of view of the people, but they could still be in the main tent. So there was a sort of a secondary tent inside for the Ark of the Covenant, which will be what they'll do with the temple. So
they have different levels that you go through, like the common people, the priests, then the high priest, then like
right.
that, right?
The temple was very much that way. So the temple had, the outer, and it would come into the outer space and worship. And then in the initial space, you could have men and women, and the next space was just men, and the next place was just priests, and the next place was just the high priest.
Right.
So, yeah. But one of the things that I find interesting is that women were allowed in the temple, and even people that weren't Jews were allowed to worship, but only to a certain point in that process, right? So we're going to. I'm not gonna skip quite yet, but you'll see what I mean. What I'll do is I'll talk. There's measurements for like four chapters there, but some of the details I want to just highlight as we Now King Hiram of Tyre sent his servants to Solomon when he heard that they had anointed him king in place of his father, for Hiram had always been a friend to David. Solomon sent word to Hiram saying, "You know that my father David could not build a house for the name of the Lord his God because of the warfare with which his enemies surrounded him, until the Lord put them under the soles of his feet. But now the Lord my God has given me rest on every side. There is neither adversary nor misfortune. So I intend to build a house for the name of the Lord my God. As the Lord said to my father David, your son, whom I will set on your throne in your place, shall build the house for my name. Therefore command that cedars from the Lebanon be cut for me. My servants will join your servants, and I will give you whatever wages you set for your servants. For you know that there is no one among us who knows how to cut timber like the Sidonians." So he's buttering the guy up. He's saying, "Hey, those trees that you have, you wouldn't mind cutting them because you guys really know how to cut timber, and I'll pay your wages." That's a good way to do it. "Oh, your trees are the best trees, and your workers are the best workers. Can we have some of that wood?" When Hiram heard the words of Solomon, he rejoiced greatly and said, "Blessed be the Lord today, who has given to David a wise son to be over this great people." Hiram sent word to Solomon, "I have heard the message you have sent to me. I will fulfill all your needs in the matter of cedar and cypress timber. My servants will bring it down to the sea from the Lebanon. I will make it into rafts to go by sea to the place you indicate. I will have them broken up there for you to take away, and you shall meet my needs by providing food for my household." So Hiram supplied Solomon's every need for timber of cedar and cypress. Solomon in turn gave Hiram 20,000 cores of wheat as food for his household and 20 cores of fine oil. I don't know what a core is.
And there's nothing that says what it is in my book.
But the second,
No.
oh, here it is. Core, as a dry measure, about 14 bushels, as a wet measure, about 35 to 60 gallons.
Wow.
Wow. 20,000 times 14 bushels. That's a lot of wheat. Solomon gave this to Hiram year by year. So the Lord gave Solomon wisdom as he promised him. There was peace between Hiram and Solomon. The two of them made a treaty. King Solomon conscripted forced labor out of all Israel. The levy numbered 30,000 men. He sent them to the Lebanon, 10,000 a month in shifts. They would be a month in Lebanon and 2 months at home. Adoniram was in charge of the forced labor. Solomon also had 70,000 laborers and 80,000 stonecutters in the hill country, besides Solomon's 3,300 supervisors who were over all the work, having charge of the people who did the work. At the king's command, they quarried out great costly stones in order to lay the foundation of the house with dressed stones. So Solomon's builders and Hiram's builders and the Gebalites did the stone cutting and prepared the timber and the stone to build the house. It's a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of wood and a lot of cattle and grain and
And my Bible says also the tax burden. So the tax of the stuff, but you notice that talk about the forced labor.
Yeah.
Not the same with slavery, so everyone has to do. It's like if you give 10% of yourself, what if 10% was you have to 10% of your year you had to work at the church, right?
Mhm.
Or work for whatever, work for the government or whatever. So that's kind of what they're doing. They can be home for 2 years, but then 1 year they have to work in service of the king,
Yes.
which is interesting. So it's forced because everybody did it, but slavery, we can debate that.
Well, my book says that resentment among the people towards this sort of forced labor eventually led to a civil uprising and the division of Solomon's kingdom immediately after his death. So obviously they were not that happy with
Not that
forced
happy
labor.
with it. That's
Yeah.
yeah. I don't have any. I do have a thing that says the remark that Solomon sent conscripted workers to the Lebanon seems to be at odds with what it says earlier, which says only the locals would be working in verse 9, when it says my servants will do this, we'll do that work. But here's where we're gonna start skipping a little bit. In the 480th year after the Israelites came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the 2nd month, he began to build the house of the Lord. The house that King Solomon built for the Lord was 60 cubits long, 20 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. The vestibule in front of the nave of the house was 20 cubits wide across the width of the house. Its depth was 10 cubits in front of the house. For the house, he made windows with recessed frames. He also built a structure against the wall of the house, running along the walls of the house, both the nave and the inner sanctuary, and he made side chambers all around. The lowest story was 5 cubits wide, the middle one was 6 cubits wide, and the third was 7 cubits wide. For around the outside of the house, he made offsets on the wall in order that the supporting beam should not be inserted into the walls of the house. The house was built with stone finished at the quarry, so that neither hammer nor axe nor any tool of iron was heard in the temple while it was being built. So they actually cut all the stone far away and transported. So that it's kind of interesting when you think about it. What if it didn't fit quite right? You know, they had to measure very, very carefully. The entrance of the middle story was on the south side of the house. One went up by winding stairs to the middle story, and from the middle story to the third. So he built the house and finished it. He roofed the house with beams and planks of cedar. He built the structure against the whole house, each story 5 cubits high, and it was joined to the house with timbers of cedar. Now the word of the Lord came to Solomon concerning this house that you are building. If you'll walk on my statutes, obey my ordinances, and keep all my commands by walking in them, then I will establish my promise with you, which I made to your father David. And I will dwell among the children of Israel, will not forsake my people Israel. So Solomon built the house and finished it. He lined the walls of the house on the inside with boards of cedar, from the floor of the house to the rafters of the ceiling. He covered them on the inside with wood, and he covered the floor of the house with boards of cypress. So, as a woodworker, let me tell you a little bit about this. Cedar is a very soft wood, but it's a beautiful wood. It's an orangish color with beautiful grain. And it was highly, there's many places in scripture where the cedars of Lebanon are considered the pinnacle of trees. Cypress is a hardwood, and it makes more sense for it to be used for the floors. And so it's interesting that he said that the cypress was used for the floors. We have the further we go into this, the more we're going to have sort of measurements and stuff, but I'll just give you some highlights. Verse 18, the cedar had carvings of gourds and open flowers. All was cedar, no stone was seen. So he basically built the outer walls with stone, and inner walls were all lined with cedar. They were all wood. They put wood paneling up all throughout the temple. Then he overlaid the altar with cedar, and he overlaid the inside of the house with pure gold. That's verse 21. So a lot of gold. I've often thought about that. Where did the gold go when the temple was destroyed? Did it go to Babylon? Where if the entire inside was lined with gold, that's a lot of gold. It was a big building. Yeah.
They probably just melted it down, took it with them.
Yeah. So he overlaid the whole house with gold in order that the whole house might be perfect. Even the whole altar that belonged to the inner sanctuary, he overlaid with gold. He made 2 cherubim of olive wood, each 10 cubits high. These are sort of, in general, the furnishings inside the titles of furnishings of the temple. Engravings of cherubim in verse 29, cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers on all the walls of the house. The floor of the house he overlaid with gold. Olive wood for the entrances. Olive wood's also, I think, a hardwood. Doors were cypress wood in verse 34. More cherubim and palm trees and open flowers. I would love sometime to see a depiction like of the temple in its glory.
Really. I have a drawing, but it's pretty much like a cutout, like halfway through the the temple is just, so it shows like just one wall, inside wall, and then the floor, and then, sort of like a cross section. But it doesn't show any of the fancy stuff.
I'm just curious. I'm just Googling it real quick and seeing if someone has ever made this is what it probably looked like on the inside.
I'll bet they did.
Mhm.
Well, that's one. Okay, that's fascinating. Here we go.
Ooh, wow. That's a
Palm
lot of
trees.
gold.
Palm trees and cherubim, and here's the Ark of the Covenant and everything overlaid.
Wow. You think God was impressed?
Yeah, interesting. I wonder if there's so I believe oh no, that's not. Thought that's the Solomon's palace, actually. So this picture, this is the outer court. Anyone is let in this outer court, but it's not technically the temple, but you could worship in here. And then through this gate was the inner court. Only the Jews could go in there. And then in this building in here was the inner part of the temple where only the men and then only the priests and stuff could go into. So, and now we have one wall, a western wall of the main building here.
Okay, so was this built on the Temple Mount?
Yeah.
It was. Okay.
So, chapter 7, Solomon was building his own house 13 years, and he finished an entire house. He built the house of the forest of Lebanon, 100 cubits long. Window frames. Yeah. I have a couple pictures in my Bible here. Give you a little idea of a cubit. Let's say a cubit, 2 cubits for a meter. So that gives you an idea of how big it was. He built a house for himself and a house for his daughter, whom he had taken in marriage. He built a house separate for her. Pretty amazing. So this is sort of the layout of the temple. You see meters, 15 meters, so it was pretty big. 60, maybe 50 meters by 15 meters, pretty big. Yards, yeah. And then the other picture on the other side is what the main temple sort of might have looked like. There. Even had windows. I think about that. Like when was glass? When were glass windows created? That's interesting to me. I didn't think that they were that old.
Didn't the Romans have glass?
I don't know. I'm just curious because of this. I'll say that I remember like watching old westerns, and they have that really bad glass and glass and windows produced in Roman Egypt in Alexandria 100 AD.
So
Probably not. They don't mention glass, but I just heard windows with frames. Maybe they're just with wooden shutters or something like that. Yeah. Anyway. So he builds a house for himself also, and he builds a hall of the throne and the hall of justice, his own house and a house for his wife. That's all the first part of that chapter 7. And then he invited and received Hiram from Tyre. He was the son of the widow of the tribe of Naphtali, a man of Tyre who had been an artisan in bronze. He cast 2 pillars of bronze. So he has a bronze worker also helping him out, who's also the other king, right? And there's great detail here. Wreaths of chain to, on the top of the pillars, columns of 2 rows around each lattice work to cover the capitals that were above the pomegranates. So the pillars were made out of brass and very ornate. And I'm going to skip a lot here. Lions, oxen, and cherubim on the stands and the walls and all of this detail. 10 basins of bronze on verse 38. There were there were like chandeliers and such. 2 pillars, 2 bowls, lattice work, all made out of bronze that King Hiram made for King Solomon. The golden altar, lampstands of pure gold. And then we come to the beginning of chapter 8. I just skipped through almost 2 full chapters because we didn't need all the measurements.
Okay.
And I'm just gonna read well, this is kind of a long chapter. How about this? Instead of we'll continue on chapter 8 next week, but I want to ask a question related to this. We talk about, especially around COVID, we talked about, that God is the church is the people, right? So we read something like this and we're like, oh, we see where our worship of our spaces sort of comes from, right? And on one hand, I think that's a fair kind of thing. On the other hand, their worship at that time was kind of different. God existed everywhere, but God was especially around the seat, which was the Ark of the Covenant. So where the Ark went was where God went, right? We don't have something exactly like that. In some ways, the temple was built to house the box that is the Ark of the Covenant, right? Which is the seat, the judgment seat. That's where God sits. So it is a little bit of a different kind of worship, but I just think, let's put this into perspective. How many times has that happened? Like, think about St. Peter in Rome, where slave labor and huge amounts of wealth were spent to build a big fancy church with gold and with all this thing. And then who, in every case, in the case of the temple, in the case of St. Peter, how many people could have been fed by that, right? By all of that wealth that went into that. But then again, you also want to honor God. So how do you, it's just an interesting, I mean, we might not be Lutheran if not for the fact that St. Peter was being built. That sounds silly, but it's kind of was a spark for that. St. Peter is built on the backs of a lot of poor people who are giving their money to try to get their people saved, right? And so St. Peter is built, and you have this huge, beautiful church. I think about that here is like, how much wealth went into that temple? The walls were lined with gold.
Yeah.
Oh, you're muted. You're muted, Nancy.
Okay, he was feeding, though, Solomon was feeding all those people and taking care of all those people that that supposedly were conscripted to build it. I mean, I'm sure that they weren't real happy about it, like it said earlier, but
Right.
you know, at least they were eating, because he knew that you have to feed your workers or they can't get anything done, right?
Right. Right. Yeah.
Now the Romans, no, I don't think they really cared. Well, there really wasn't Romans building the basilica, but you know,
Yeah.
they, I don't think that the Italians cared that much for people as opposed to, you know, Solomon.
I will say, even at the time of Solomon, there's a couple references that I didn't dwell on, but there was a sense of a tax too. You know, that money, the wealth had to come from somewhere.
Mhm.
And so some of it was these different governors bringing things. Well, where did it come from? The governors? It did come from the people, you know. You have 10 oxen, you're going to give 2 to support the king. Right.
But everybody has to pay tax.
Yeah, even back then. But
Yeah.
there's a couple references to that. Like the gold had to come from somewhere, the stone had to come from somewhere. So everyone kind of contributed to the building of the temple, and out of their own
Mhm.
stuff. So yeah, it's I think I don't know if it's actually in scripture. It doesn't really reference it too much, but I think the Jewish faith changes dramatically with the destruction of the temple, especially the second time, which happens after Jesus in 70 AD. Because I've heard people sort of criticize Muslims for doing their pilgrimage at least once in their lifetime. They've got to go to Mecca and and go to that place. Well, that place is, and that the reason for that is in scripture, in our scripture, by the way. When Abraham's son Ishmael is going to be left in the desert, and that place becomes a holy place where God spoke to them and said, "You'll become a great nation." Early Jews made pilgrimages to Jerusalem, to the temple, and once the temple's built, they made pilgrimage. And even some Christians made pilgrimage to the temple. Early Christians made pilgrimage to the temple because it was the God of their ancestors too.
Yeah.
So I've heard people criticize pilgrimage. I'm like, well, it happened. And if your part of your belief is that God, even Christians, they're like, well, yeah, God's everywhere, but man, that temple is holy. You're still going to at least honor the temple, right?
Yeah.
So the temple holds a very important place, not just in Jewish history, but in Christian history too. Not just as our prehistory, but even after Jesus, it still is important. And so I think the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, the second destruction of the temple, really changes Jewish and even Christian faith to a certain degree, because then your theology has to revolve around God is everywhere and in everything.
Mm-hmm.
You have to. You can't say, well, I'm the cat's away, the mice will play, kind of, right? I'm not near the temple, so I can maybe get away with some things because God's a little further away. He's over there, right? That there's a shift, I think, a little bit of a shift in how they view God because of the destruction of the temple later on. So, well, thank you both.
Thank you.
Yes.
And I will talk to you later.
All right.